guys, it's Miss Pepworth. This is another Cinderella story today. This is called The Rough-Faced Girl, and I really like this version of the Cinderella story. It's a Native American version of Cinderella. I'm going to read you a little bit about what the author wrote because I like the background information here. It's called The Rough-Faced Girl, an Algonquin, I might be saying that wrong, an Algonquin Indian Cinderella is originally part of a longer and more complex story. The rough-faced girl remains one of the most magical, mysterious, and beautiful of all Cinderellas. So it's called The Rough-Faced Girl. This is a version of Cinderella that is a Native American story, so it's been told for a long time. Once long ago, let me sit this way and you can look at the picture while I read. Once long ago, there was a village by the shores of Lake Ontario. Off from the other wigwams of this village stood one great, huge wigwam. Painted on its sides were pictures of the sun, moon, stars, plants, trees, and animals. And inside this wigwam, there was said to have lived a very great, rich, powerful, and supposedly handsome, invisible being. However, no one could see him except his sister who lived there too. Many women wanted to marry this invisible being, but his sister said only the one who sees him can marry him. Now in this village there lived a poor man who had 3 daughters. 2 older daughters were cruel and hard-hearted. They made their youngest sister sit by the fire and feed the flames. When the burning branches popped, the fire sparks fell on her. This time her hands were burnt. In time her hands became burnt and scarred. Her arms, too, became rough and scarred. Even her face was marked by the fire. Her beautiful, long black hair hung ragged and charred. And those 2 older sisters laughed at her, saying, "Ha, you're ugly, you rough-faced girl." And they made her very lonely and miserable indeed. So there's our Cinderella. Cinder is like ash from a fire, so Cinderellas have gotten their names because that character is always one that is working in the fire and building the fire and cleaning up. This rough-faced girl became rough-faced because the fire sparks hit her skin and made scars on her, so she has real rough, not very pretty skin, the rough-faced, so they call her the rough-faced girl. One day, these 2 older sisters went to their father and said, "Father, give us some necklaces. Give us some new buckskin dresses. Give us some pretty beaded moccasins. We're going to marry the invisible being." So their father gave them these things. Dressed in their finest, the 2 girls marched through the village. All the people pointed and stared. "Look at those beautiful girls," they said. "Surely they shall marry the invisible being." And if those 2 girls were proud and hard-hearted before, they're even prouder now. They walked haughtily through the village, and at last they came to the wigwam of the invisible being, and there his sister was waiting. So the invisible being is like the prince in this story. That's who they are hoping to marry. And the prince's sister, the invisible being's sister, is the one that kind of guards his world and says, "You can only marry him if you see him." Remember they said that at the beginning. "Why have you come?" she asked. "We want to marry the invisible being," they answered. "That's why we're here." "If you want to marry my brother," she replied, "you have to be able to see him." "Tell me, have you seen the invisible being?" "Of course we've seen him," they insisted. "Can't you see how pretty we are? Can't you see the beautiful clothes we wear? Oh yes, anyone can tell that we've truly seen the invisible being." "All right," she said quietly. "If you think you've seen him, then tell me, what is his bow made out of?" And suddenly her voice was swift as lightning and strong as thunder. His bow?" they stammered in surprise. "His bow? Oh, we know." But turning desperately to one another, they whispered, "What shall we say? Let's say it's the oak tree." So they said, "It's the great oak tree." "No," said the sister of the invisible being. "No." Oh, she saw at once how they lied. "Tell me," she continued, "if you think you've seen my brother, the invisible being, then what's the runner of his sled made out of?" We know," cried the 2 sisters, but they whispered feverishly again, and they wondered, "What shall we say? What shall we say?" "Let's say it's the green willow branch." "No," said the sister when she heard. "No, you have not seen my brother. Now go home." "Just test us fairly," they exclaimed. "We've seen him. Just don't ask us all these silly questions." "All right," said the sister of the invisible being. "Come with me." And she took them back to the great wigwam and sat them in the seats furthest from the entrance, the guests' seats. And soon they heard footsteps coming along the path, and then something stepped inside, and they heard breathing, and the two sisters still couldn't see a thing. And suddenly a great bow and a beaded quiver of arrows appeared in the air and were set down. But those two girls sat there, their eyes wide. All through that night they never saw a thing more, and in the morning they had to go home ashamed. They never saw the invisible being. The next day, the rough-faced girl went to her father. "Father, may I please have some beads? May I have a new buckskin dress and some pretty moccasins? I'm going to marry the invisible being, for wherever I look, I see his face." But the father sighed. "Daughter," he said, "I'm sorry. I have no beads left for you, only some little broken shells. And I have no buckskin dress. And as for moccasins, all I have left are my old, worn, cracked, and stretched out pair from last year. They're much too big for you." But she said, "Wherever you can spare, I can use." So he gave her these things. Then she found, oops, I missed a page. Then she found dried reeds. Taking the little broken shells, she strung a necklace. She stripped birch from the dead trees and made a cap and a dress and leggings. And then with a sharp piece of bone, she carved into the bark pictures of the sun, moon, stars, plants, trees, and animals. She went down to the lake shore and soaked the moccasins in the water until they grew soft. And then she molded them around her feet. But they were still too big, and they flapped like duck's feet as she walked. And then all the people came out of their wigwams, and they pointed and stared. "Look at that ugly girl," they laughed. "Look at her strange clothes. Ha ha ha. Go home, you ugly girl. You'll never marry the invisible being." But the rough-faced girl had faith in herself. She had courage. She didn't turn back. She just kept walking on right through the village. And as she walked, she saw the great beauty of the earth and sky spreading before her. And truly, she alone, of all in that village, saw in these things the sweet yet awesome face of the invisible being. Look closely at this page. See if you can see the invisible being in the nature pictures around her. See it? And at last she came to the lake shore, just as the sun was sinking behind the hills, and the many stars came glittering out like a fiery veil in the darkened sky overhead. And there, standing at the water's edge, was the sister of the invisible being, waiting. Now, the sister of the invisible being was a wise woman. When she looked at you, she didn't see just your face or your hair or your clothes. No. When she looked at you, she would look right in your eyes, and she could see all the way down to your heart. And she could tell if you were good, if you had a good, kind heart, or a cold, hard, cruel one. And when she looked at the rough-faced girl, she saw at once, though her skin was scarred, her hair burnt, her clothes strange, she had a beautiful, kind heart. And she welcomed her dearly, saying, "Oh, my sister, why have you come?" And the rough-faced girl replied, "I have come to marry the invisible being." "Oh," said the sister, very gently now, "if you want to marry him, you have to have seen him. Now tell me, have you seen my brother, the invisible being?" And the rough-faced girl said, "Yes." "All right then," said the sister, "if you have seen him, tell me, what is his bow made out of?" And the rough-faced girl said, "His bow? Why, it's the great curve of the rainbow." "Oh," said the sister, with excitement. "Tell me," she asked, If you have seen my brother, the invisible being, what is the runner of his sled made out of? See how he's standing on this? He's holding it with stars. What's this right here? What's he standing on as he goes down? That's his sled. And the rough-faced girl, looking up into the night sky, said, the runner of his sled? Why, it's the spirit road, the Milky Way of stars that spreads across the sky. Oh, cried the sister in wonder and delight. You have seen him. Come with me. And taking the rough-faced girl by the hand, she led her back to the great wigwam and sat her in the seat next to the entrance, the wife's seat. And then she heard footsteps coming along the path closer and closer. And the entrance flap of the wigwam lifted up, and in stepped the invisible being. And when he saw her sitting there, he said, at last, we have been found out. And then, smiling kindly, he added, oh, my sister, she's beautiful. And his sister said, yes. And the sister of the invisible being then gave rough-faced girl the finest buckskin robes and a necklace of perfect shells. Now go bathe in the lake, she said, and dress in these. So the rough-faced girl bathed in the waters of the lake, and suddenly all the scars vanished from her body, and her skin grew smooth, and her beautiful black hair grew in long and glossy as a raven's wing. Now anyone could see that she was indeed beautiful, and the invisible being and his sister had seen that from the start. Then at last the rough-faced girl and the invisible being were married. They lived together in great gladness and were never parted. So the magic part of this story came actually after they fell in love and met and fell in love. And then she magically became beautiful and dressed in beautiful clothes and had beautiful hair and skin. So it's kind of a different mixed up order, the way they found each other and how they met. So this is a Native American version of this Cinderella story, the common Cinderella story called The Rough-Faced Girl. Bye, class.